The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we will be speaking with Brigadier General John Adams. General Adams retired from the U.S. Army in September 2007. He is the president of Guardian 6, a defense and national security consulting firm advising governments, businesses, and nonprofits. His final military assignment was as Deputy United States Military Representative to NATO, in particular to the Military Command in Brussels, the highest military authority of NATO. In his decades of service, he has served 18 years overseas in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, including assignments with U.S. embassies in Belgium, Rwanda, Croatia, and South Korea, where as an Army Foreign Area Officer and as a military attaché. He served in the Pentagon on 9/11 and is a veteran of Operation Desert Storm and Operation Guardian Assistance in Rwanda. General Adams, welcome to the show from Florida.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. It is truly an honor for us to have you on today. And in full disclosure, I've known you for many years and consider you a great friend. So thank you so much for being on this show today.
And I feel every bit the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So General Adams, you've written and spoken to Congress about the danger facing our defense supply chain. Could you explain why we should be worried about this issue?
The defense supply chain is critical to our national security. We should be concerned because it has taken us almost 30 years to get to the point now where we can't depend on the lower tiers of our supply chain. In many cases, we don't even know where those lower tiers of the supply chain originate. I'll explain. So when we look at an aircraft or a tank or a ship, we can take the ship out of the shipyard, we can take the aircraft out of the factory, we can take the tank out of the factory, but there's so many pieces that go into that may be everything from the handles on a truck or a lever or in an aircraft, a switch. Those things are the problems that we have in our supply chain. We know that our aircraft come from the factory. We know that our ships come from U.S. shipyards. It's a law. We know that the tanks, most of our armored vehicles are made in the United States, but we don't know where all the parts that are in those vehicles and equipment come from. That's the problem. And we've really never gotten any kind of handle on where those parts come from in the first place. So we don't even know the scope of the problem. We also make our equipment, our vehicles, our tanks, our ships with raw materials, many of which come from other countries. I'll give you a couple of examples: steel, aluminum, chips, semiconductors that we use. Most of our steel that's imported into the United States doesn't come from the United States. It might seem like steel is fungible. I can use whatever steel I want from wherever, and it's the same. And that is not true. Especially for military purposes. A very small percentage of the steel that we produce or anybody produces goes into military uses. But if you're talking about the steel of a nuclear submarine hull, you don't want that to be weak or to have any kind of problems with it. We can't afford to use steel made in China, for example, for nuclear submarine hulls. But you asked the question, I'll cut to the chase and give an answer that it's taken a long time to get here, to this point where we don't even know where some of our lower tier supply chain items come from. And it's going to take us a long time to climb out of a really dependent situation where we, again, don't know. And sometimes we know enough to know that we're really vulnerable. The equipment and the materials are not reliable.
General Adams, what lessons have you learned from observing the Ukraine war, and how do you see it ending, and what does this mean for the future of the United States Armed Forces?
I'll start with the top. One of the things that we tried to do from the very beginning is to use sanctions as a way to limit the conflict. It has apparently not been successful. Does Russia's economy suffer from the sanctions? Yes. Does it work? Yes. So if the intent was to try to cripple Russia with sanctions, it didn't work. That's one important lesson. I think we're relearning that because sanctions never really have worked well. Puts pressure on, but it doesn't resolve the situation. The other thing that we've learned, I think, is just from a pure military perspective, warfare is not what we thought it would be. We thought the Russians would overrun Ukraine. They have more tanks, more armored vehicles, more people, more airplanes. I mean, you name it, they were ahead in terms of their numbers. But what's really shaped the war and allowed Ukraine to survive, one of the biggest weapons that they've used is drones. And they've been able to get the drones pretty successfully, and they're making their own now. So Ukraine has really showed that they've leveled up the conflict militarily. One, they're fighting well, no question about that, and they are able to get military equipment. But the most important thing they've been able to get is drones. They've learned the same thing during the war that the Israelis learned on the Suez Canal in 1973. They had better tanks than the Arabs did, than the Egyptians did, but the Arabs had small guided missiles, and they would take out the Israeli tanks. The Israelis figured out how to reverse that advantage, and Russia has to some extent blunted the Ukraine superiority in drones and guided missiles too. But that's one of the other things we've learned. And the other thing we've learned is this war is not. We thought it would go quickly. We, the U.S., thought it would go quickly. We bet on it. It's not going well for the Ukrainians. They've lost territory, and they've not been able to. This recent counteroffensive has been remarkably unsuccessful. With the real result of all this is that both sides are bleeding, and civilians on both sides are dying. We have 2 to 3 million displaced people. It's unlikely they're going to be able to go back home in the near future. And the prospect is that sort of dynamic will continue as long as the conflict continues. So how's it going to end? I think it will probably end along the lines of where the current zone of occupation is that the Russians have taken. Is that a value judgment? No, not at all. The Russians are brutes. Putin is a really bad actor. He's hurting his own people. I don't admire him at all. He's a terrible person. No question about it. I wish this never happened. We bear some of the responsibility for this happening in the first place, in my opinion. But I think it's going to end pretty much along the lines it is now, with the Russians retaining most of the Donbass area, Crimea. The Ukrainians will continue to plug away at their counteroffensive, the counteroffensive is going to end soon enough anyway with the coming of winter. But I don't see the lines. I see the lines stabilizing along where they are now. I think that eventually the desire to keep this going will abate in our country, and which will mean that the Ukrainians will be they'll be able to overcome the reluctance to settle along these lines, and then we'll see the end of the conflict. I think that end will come surprisingly and quickly when they realize that it's not going to be an endless amount of weapons that we're going to give to the Ukrainians. The other thing that's keeping it going, our arms manufacturers are making pretty good money off of this. The equipment lines that were running pretty well for Iraq and Afghanistan needed to ramp up again. We found the way. And so the arms manufacturers are doing pretty well right now. There's no incentive economically for us to stop supporting this war. There's a lot of people making money off of this.
General Adams, thank you for that discussion. I want to turn a little bit to now domestic politics, as we're seeing now in Congress. We're seeing debates about the budget and a possible government shutdown. You were a representative to NATO once when the government shut down due to an impasse over the budget. Given that we're often facing these government shutdowns now, how does a budget shutdown affect our ability to conduct effective foreign and military policy?
Well, one of the roles that I had as the deputy U.S. military representative to NATO was defending our country against everything from skepticism to direct attack on our policies. And I did my best. I tried to make sure that whatever I said in public was positive for our government. And I think on the whole, I had to defend our engagement in Iraq, which was tough with NATO, but I did it because my loyalty is to my country, and I was a serving military officer. I would always back our policy. It was tough. When we have things, and I remember the skepticism that I faced from colleagues, even really good allies like the UK, when they would see that it was difficult for us to fund our own government. It does not add to our credibility as an ally when we do that. Does it affect us in the micro sense, in the sense that we can continue to operate? Actually, as you probably know, there are plenty of ways to work around even a budget shutdown. I've seen things that weren't funded, like parts of the government can't operate, but they're not the parts that, for example, operate our military, operate our State Department, and so forth. We continue to operate. The lights stay on, the people come to work, and they do their work. The real effect is at this confidence level in the United States. It's hard to go to an ally and have them have absolute confidence in our government and the way it is able to function if we can't even fund it. I think it really is that important. Is it important in our own country? Yeah, I think people in our country lose confidence in our government when they can't figure out how to fund it. But I think the effect overseas is large too. So the major effect is the lack of confidence in the United States.
Excellent. General Adams, you were on the Pentagon on 9/11, and at that time the world was with us. Yet today we find ourselves in a very different situation. How have our policies since then led so many countries to be against us?
I think that just to come back to the confidence in the United States, I think our allies especially were surprised at how we got distracted after 9/11 on goals that they saw as inappropriate. I just refer to the war in Iraq. Why did we pivot to Iraq? I can't answer that. And I was in the Pentagon. I worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I saw I was part of the discussions that went on when we were doing this pivot to Iraq. And it was sudden. It was really early in 2002 that we did that pivot. In 2001, the Pentagon was really sort of discombobulated by, we didn't expect it. I'm convinced it was a surprise. I really believe that our first reactions were actually good. It wasn't, but we were in a really difficult surprise situation. I represented the Secretary of Defense in October 2001 because I was a colonel and they weren't sending generals overseas at the time. So I got the call to go to Rome for the first meeting of the NATO defense ministers after 9/11. It was a surprise to me. I was the only colonel in the room. There were a number of very senior people in the room with me in Rome. And I remember a lot of conversations about, we're there for you, we're with you, we'll do whatever that we can to help. And countries had their own ideas about what was helpful, but it was you're right, it was, our allies were on our side. When we went to Iraq, our allies weren't on our side. There was a tremendous amount of skepticism. And the most important skepticism was, well, why are you doing this? There weren't any there weren't any Iraqis involved in 9/11 as far as we know. It wasn't a clear line of responsibility to Saddam Hussein. In fact, at first, we sort of made it up that there were weapons of mass destruction there. We loosely called weapons of mass destruction chemical weapons, and of course, a chemical weapon is a weapon of mass destruction, but it's not nuclear, which is what we were implying. There were no nukes being built in Iraq. Iraq was not a direct threat to the United States. So our allies were puzzled why we would do that. When we were in Afghanistan, and NATO was in Afghanistan very quickly, as we know, when we were in Afghanistan, a lot of the countries that were in Afghanistan with us couldn't understand what we were doing, what our objectives were. It sort of floundered around for about 10 years until President Obama sent, I think ultimately it was about 90,000 troops to Afghanistan. Our allies couldn't understand that. They did fight with us. They did fight with us in Afghanistan, but they couldn't understand what our vacillations were all about. Who's making our policy and why? What is the relationship between our political, military, and our national security policy to what happened in 9/11? They couldn't understand it. It was a lack of confidence and a real puzzlement. I think we could have done to make it better would be to, one, articulate our decisions more effectively, which would have caused us to question our own decisions a little bit. I don't think we did enough introspection as a country after 9/11. And I think it would have been better if we'd put our allies in a position of close consultation as opposed to just sort of telling them what we're going to do, and which is how it came across. We're going to tell you all what to do, and that doesn't work well with allies especially.
Thank you. I want to turn to the time when you were a military attaché in Croatia. What were the most valuable lessons you learned there?
I think the most valuable lesson I learned as a military attaché was the importance of relationships with even a small country like Croatia. I mean, it really is a small country, but it has an outsized influence on its region, and that's the point. We had an ongoing relationship or engagement with Bosnia, which is right next to Croatia. Croatia has a tremendous effect on Bosnia. We needed them to be on side, so to speak, with our efforts in Bosnia. We needed Croatia to be on side with our efforts in Kosovo. I had a direct role in making sure that that was the case. And a lot of this happens behind the scenes. I had a personal, direct, very day-to-day relationship with the defense minister of Croatia. I knew what the government was doing. I actually had, I think, I wasn't telling them, certainly wasn't telling them what to do, but I had some role in suggesting courses of action that would be good for both our countries. And it did have a positive effect. You may remember in 1999, we had an operation called Allied Force, which was designed to really blunt the effect of the Yugoslav, Serb attacks on Kosovo. We did a very good job in Croatia of affecting that, in many different ways, some of which I can't really discuss. But it was because Croatia was so influential in the region, because they had so many good ties with the other countries in the region. We, the U.S., had a very good tie and a very good influence in the region. There were things we could do working through Croatia that we could never have done otherwise. Croatia is a great friend of the United States, remains a great friend of the United States. One of the things that I learned was the importance of keeping a country that you're representing, that you're representative in, on side, keeping them understanding what you're doing and forming really good relationships with the leadership. It had a positive effect on our foreign policy and our military policy in the region.
Excellent. Excellent. General Adams, what do you think are the biggest threats facing the United States today, and what should we do to overcome these threats?
I think without question, the greatest threat to the United States today is China. It's a threat for a lot of known reasons, and it's a threat for a lot of latent reasons that we don't hear about much and we haven't really spent much time on. We understand that China is economy is the second in the world. We understand that their military is growing all the time. Let me give a couple of statistics that certainly alarm me. Their Navy's bigger than ours. They have more ships than we do, to the order of 330 to 290. That's a pretty good advantage. And you consider that China, we've always considered them a regional power. They're not. They're global, and they've become global in the last few years. Hypersonics, a very important technology. China has an advanced development of hypersonics. They've tested it. They're well on the way to deploying it. And when they do, we're not going to have a program. Our system is nowhere close to development. And I don't know that because there's a lot of projects that we don't know about that are classified. But I suspect, based on what we can tell, that our program is far beyond theirs. And hypersonics is a game changer in warfare. The kinds of weapons that they can deploy with hypersonics can really be effective in a global conflict. Russia's working on it too, but China's got a more advanced program than Russia does. The problem with China is that we are so unaware of much of their development. We don't even know how many nuclear weapons they have. For example, we have a pretty good idea of how many nuclear weapons Russia has because we have a treaty and we've negotiated with them. We don't have a treaty with China, none. So all their multiple independent rocket systems, most of them are mobile, most of them are hidden. We don't know where they are, and there's no treaty obligation for them to disclose it. They know where ours are because we have a treaty with Russia, and they probably share details like that with Russia. Their budget is bigger than ours. They have a greater than $1 trillion defense budget. Ours is only $830 billion. And that sounds like a lot of money. And it sounds like, oh, well, and they're talking about that scale. How much difference is that? Well, it's important because that means that they have that many more programs, that much more depth in research, that much more personnel, well-trained personnel, scientists working on their programs. It's important. Diplomatic power. As we know, China negotiated a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran 4 months ago. That's a big deal. We were surprised that happened because can you imagine in the last few years we postulated that Iran and Saudi Arabia were deeply skeptical of each other, and then they should be by all rights. Strategically, Saudi Arabia should fear Iranian expansion, should fear Iranian power in the region. But now they recognize each other. They have diplomatic relationships. They're beginning to develop trade ties. This is a problem. And who negotiated that? China did. That is the definition of soft power. And we say we're better at soft power? I'm skeptical. I happen to know because I served in Africa with the U.S. forces in the middle 90s. And I was amazed at all the Chinese diplomats and soldiers I came across. Our presence was minimal. Theirs was massive. They had a great presence, even in Central Africa, which you wouldn't realize that's not close to China. They don't have traditional ties, but they know where the power is, and they want to increase their power in developing countries, and they've done a really good job at doing that. So soft power, they've got it. Hard power, yes, bigger Navy, hypersonics, other sorts of programs that we are far behind them on. So I think China is our greatest threat. And I just have to consider all the things we don't know. And the Chinese espionage program is massive, as we know. We do know what's massive. We know there are Chinese agents all over the United States. I remember going to college in University of Massachusetts 30 years ago. I had Chinese students in my classes. And they were great guys. I enjoyed their company. But I knew they'd go back home and do what they're supposed to do, which is to help the Chinese government. And it didn't stop my friendship because I'm a nice guy. I like to work with other students. They're nice people. But I was amazed that we're just tolerating this. You're probably familiar with the Confucius Institutes. Maybe there's a Confucius Institute at Troy. I don't know. Confucius Institutes, they're part of the Chinese government. And they're there for the benefit of the government of China. and they're going to provide. They're going to gather information on our students, and of course they're going to do that. And we're going to gather information on them, but we're not looking at them the same way they're looking at us. I don't think we have a malicious intent towards China. I really don't. I think most Americans like to meet people from other countries. I think we do our share of counterintelligence against them, but they're working us hard. And when they send their students here, they send their programs like the Confucius Institute here, they're gathering information and they're figuring out how to use it against the United States. We saw the balloon fly over the United States. It mystified me. What? We're just letting them gather information, and when it gets to the other side of the country, their mission is done. They're not going to gather information over the Atlantic. They got what they wanted, and it's not a downlink, a real-time downlink to stations in the United States. It's satellite link to China. They got what they wanted, and we didn't do anything. We didn't do anything. In fact, we looked stupid because then we shot down some hobbyist balloon, I think over Michigan or someplace. It made us look pretty foolish. But China's going, yeah, we got the information we wanted. Chinese espionage is massive, and it will continue. Let me talk real briefly about a couple of other threats, which I think are real important. Related to China, because Chinese are using this to get assets across our border with Mexico. Our border's open. We can hear a lot of loose talk from both sides about what's happening on the border. But truth is, it's open. We all know it, and we don't even know who's coming across the border. And then Iran. Iran is something we just gave them $6 billion to do who knows what with. They're developing their nuclear program, and they still appear to be ways out, but not that far. And I think their involvement with terrorism is well noted. It's a threat to the United States.
General Adams, I want to, in the seconds that we've got left, I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. It was a real honor and a real pleasure for both of us to speak to you, and I know that we learned a tremendous amount from you, so thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Michael.